Hello everyone, welcome to the session of AA Audit and Assurance. And in this session, we will be discussing the core area of our syllabus, that's the area of audit risk. And we'll be discussing the main examiners coming from this area. Well, we know that it's very important to have in-depth knowledge in the topic audit risk, mainly because anyway we can expect a question from this area. So you might have heard the quote, stop dreaming and start doing. And for the paper AA, it's stop reading and start practicing. Because for the paper AA, we have got a lot of past questions, we've got a lot of questions in our revision kits, and you might have also received a lot of questions from your faculties as well. So the practice of the questions from this area is very important, as usually we used to get a lot of repetitive points in our question based on our past exams. So if you practice each of the past questions properly, you can make sure that you will be familiar with almost all the points that will be asked as part of our exam. So what do you mean by the area of audit risk? So I believe everyone is now familiar with the definition audit risk, as it's the risk of giving an inappropriate opinion on a company's financial statements when the financial statements are materially misstated. So there's always a possibility that the auditor might express an inappropriate opinion on a company's financial statements. And the main cause of audit risk are inherent risk, control risk, and detection risk. And we have also studied the meaning of each of these terms. When it comes to inherent risk, before considering any related controls of a company, there's always a possibility that the company's financial statements assertion might contain material mistakes. So the possibility of having mistakes at the assertion level can be considered as inherent risk. When it comes to the control risk, a company's internal control system might not be operating effectively. Therefore, the internal control system will not be able to prevent, detect, or correct the mistakes in the company's financial statements, and that can be called as a control risk. And when it comes to the detection risk, that is a one and only risk that arises from the part of the auditor. The auditor have performed a lot of audit procedures, but unfortunately, by performing procedures from the end of the auditor is unable to identify the mistakes in the company's financial statements. So when an auditor is not able to find out mistakes in the company's financial statements by performing procedures, it can be considered as a risk from the part of the auditor, and that risk will be known as detection risk. So the audit risk will be the combination of inherent risk, control risk, and detection risk. So basically we can summarize the inherent risk and control risk together as risk of material misstatements, as the inherent risk and control risk will create mistakes in the company's financial statements, and detection risk is the risk because of which an auditor is not able to identify the mistakes that have already taken place in a company's financials. So all this can be together be considered as audit risk. So whenever you get a question, you should consider the risk that might arise from the part of the auditor, which would result in detection risk, as well as you should also consider the possibility of mistakes in a company's financial statements. So both of this can be combined together to result in an overall audit risk. Then, well, we know that when it comes to a question, usually you will be getting the questions in this pattern. The examiner will be asking you to identify the audit risk from the scenario, and they will also be asking you to provide an auditor's responses for the same. So when you get a question on the audit risk, you should make sure that to get 2 marks for both the audit risk and its response, you should be clearly identifying the audit risk from the scenario, for which you will be getting half mark. And again, you should be properly explaining the risk, again for which you will be getting another half mark. And when you give a proper response, you will get 1 mark for the response. But when it comes to the identification and explanation part, when you identify the risk from the scenario, it can be copy pasted. There's no issues with that. But make sure that when you identify a risk, you should be giving proper explanation. If you have just identified without giving any explanation for the risk, you will not be getting a proper marks on this area. So how you need to explain the risk? So that's the most important thing here. So when you want to explain a risk, make sure that if the risk is based on accounting treatment, if something went wrong with the accounting treatment in the scenario, you should first clearly specify the required accounting treatment there. Then you should mention what will go wrong, and finally you should also reflect the impact. So say for example, consider that if it is mentioned in the scenario that the client company is spending 20 million on research and development. In that case, we know that as per IAS 38 intangible asset, all the research expenses should be expensed in the P&L and only those development expenditures can be capitalized. So what will be the possibility of mistake here? There can be chances that company might have treated some of the research expenses as part of development expenditure. And what will be the cause in that case or impact in that case? This will result in overstated intangible asset and understated expenses. So this is the real explanation for the risk. So if the risk is based on accounting treatment, you should be clearly specifying what accounting treatment is required, then what will go wrong in that case, then the impact should also be clearly specified. So as a complete sentence, we can frame the audit risk explanation like this. Allen Company have spent 20 million on research and development. As per IAS 38 intangible asset, all the research expenses should be expensed in the P&L and the development expenditure should only be capitalized. However, there can be chances that company might have capitalized some of the research expenses, resulting in overstated intangible asset and understated related expenses. So this should be the way in which you will be explaining the audit risk explanation. And there are also possibilities where you will be getting questions without accounting treatment. In that case, you are only required to identify the risk, explain it in your own words how it will create a risk, and show the impact that will be created over the company's financial statements. So you should be identifying the risk and properly giving the explanation to score 2 marks in this area for both the risk and response. Then again, it is important to look into the scenario. Anyway, the scenario will give you more risk than what is actually required by the examiner. So the examiner might be asking you to give 7 risks in total, but still you will be able to find more than 10 risks from the scenario. So make sure that when you read the scenario, you should be highlighting each of the important risks from the scenario. And whenever you try to identify a risk, you should never try to properly identify the issues in the scenario. Instead, you should first try to pick what is actually required as per the scenario. So say for example, if it is mentioned that the company have spent 20 million on research and development, you should not initially directly try to pick what is risk in that case. Instead, you should try to understand what is the required accounting treatment if 20 million is spent on research and development. Then you have to think, okay, in this case, what will go wrong from the scenario? And that will give you the actual answer for a risk. Instead, you should not directly pick the risk from the scenario. Always try to pick the required accounting treatment from the scenario, and its vice versa can be chosen as the risk. Then, once you have read the scenario properly, as I mentioned earlier, you should be using the highlight function. You should highlight each of the important risks, and then you should pick which risk you will be able to write properly. That should be given the first priority, and that should be given as answer. Then you can avoid those risks for which you are not having proper answers. And again, you should be following a strategic approach. So when you give the risk, you should be making sure that you are giving only answers to most strongest points which you are familiar with. Make sure that when the examiner is asking for 7 points, you should not give more than 7 points, because it will just kill off your time. At the same time, you won't be getting any additional marks for that. So make sure that you are answering according to the requirement, and you are not required to provide any additional points. And again, you should try to avoid the overlap of information, which means there are situations where some scenarios might lead to same risk. Say for example, it may be mentioned in the scenario that the company is having some concerns about credit worthiness of some of the customers. And later on in the scenario itself, it is mentioned that the company's receivables days have increased from 20 days to 40 days. So both of this case shows the possibility of having bad and doubtful debts for the company. And in which case the company should have created either an allowance for bad and doubtful debts, or the bad and doubtful debts should be written off from the financial statements. If not, what will happen? There can be chances that the receivables will be overstated and the related expenses will be understated. So that's a risk in this case. But the both scenario is leading to same risk. In those cases, this can be considered as overlap of information. So you should summarize it into a single point and you should write it only once. If you give the same risk twice, then in that case you won't be getting any marks. So you will be getting only 1 mark for the first risk. You will not be getting any mark for the second risk given. So make sure that you should avoid overlap of information. If the risk is having same explanation and impact, it should be combined together. And whenever you explain the risk, as I mentioned earlier, you should be clearly specifying the impact of each of the risk. After giving the explanation, you should not just write that it may result in the material mistakes of financial statements. Rather than writing material mistakes, you should specify what is the actual impact that will be reflected in the financials. Say for example, if it is something that affects the inventory related valuation or inventory related accounting standards, so in that case you can specify that the value of inventory will be overstated. If there is something which is relating to bad and doubtful debts, you should mention that the receivables will be overstated rather than just writing that the financial statements are misstated. However, there are certain cases where you can also mention about the overall misstatement as well. Say for example, if it is mentioned in the scenario that a new finance director has been appointed who is not having any familiarity with the industry in which the company is currently operating. So in that case, there is a possibility of having material mistakes in the company's financial statements. However, that will be an overall impact because in that case, we are not having any further information on whether the company's specific element of the financials is affected or not. So in that case, you can write an overall impact as well. So you should be having precision in whatever things are you mentioning. So specifically mention which element of the financials will be understated or overstated. Then the most important area, that's the area of auditor's response. When you give your answers for auditor's response, you should be mentioning about the auditor's response itself and you should not be indirectly or directly mentioning to the management's response. Say for example, I have mentioned an example here. There are several students who suggest that the company should focus on training on the staff on new sales system. So if you give any training to the staff, it's a management's response which management have to take. However, we are here mentioning about the auditor's response which the auditor need to take in order to identify the material mistakes in the financial statements. So we should always be focusing on the fact to figure out whether there are any possibility of mistakes in the company's financial statements. So these are the actions to be taken by the auditor and not by the management. So you should be clearly specifying the auditor's responses itself. And in addition to that, whenever you give response, it is not required to have a very detailed paragraph on the procedure. Instead, you just have to mention what procedures that you need to perform. In case of document or information is required, what all are the documents or information which you require to identify whether there is mistake and what is the purpose of performing this procedure. So procedure plus document or information plus whatever be the purpose, that should be clearly specified. So say for example, consider that there is a risk in company's financial statements as the company have transferred some of the information in relation to the inventory. There can be chances of having omission or duplication of inventory, thereby the inventory will be overstated or understated. And we need to give an auditor's responses for that. So you should clearly think on what an auditor need to do in this case to identify whether there is mistake in the company's financials. Discuss with the management about the level of controls taken by the management while transferring data to the other entity to consider whether the data is transferred completely and accurately. If possible, perform test of controls to ensure that the controls are effective. So this will be the response in that area. So basically this will be the actions that need to be taken by the auditor and not by the management. So whenever you write the response part, make sure that there should be a procedure. There should be a document or information that need to be collected or obtained by the auditor or evaluated by the auditor. Plus there should be a purpose for which you are performing this response. Then the term professional skepticism, the auditor using a questioning mind, is familiar to every student who learns the paper doubly. But make sure that you are not giving just professional skepticism as a response to the risk. In most majority of cases, whenever there is issues in relation to the fraud or whenever there is issues in relation to the managerial bias and all, always the candidate will mention that the audit team should maintain professional skepticism. But this should only be considered as an add-on point. You should be having another primary procedure or response need to be taken from the end of the auditor. Plus you can give this point as an add-on to that. So make sure that you are providing another response in case of management bias or in case of bonus or related possibilities of fraud and all. And you can consider using the professional skepticism as an add-on point to the primary point. So this is what you need to consider while giving answers in relation to the audit risk. Then, I hope you are familiar with the area of analytical procedures. Well, we know that analytical procedures is considered to be one of the main part of the audit risk questions also. So, in which case the auditor will be asking you to the examiner will be asking you to calculate some of the ratios, and you are also required to consider these ratios while analyzing the risk and the possibilities of mistakes in the financial statements. So basically, when you're getting questions on the area of analytical procedures, you will be getting half mark for each of the ratios calculated. When you are required to calculate operating profit margin, you will be getting half mark for the current year calculation and half mark for the previous year calculation. So in total, in this case, as an example, you will be getting 2 marks. But you are not required to provide any formulas or calculations. You are only required to give the final answer or the computed figures. So make sure that the figures that you have computed is accurate, and you need to use your financial reporting related knowledge to calculate the ratios. And when you calculate the ratio, you should be using that as part of your risk analysis answer as well. So say for example, if you computed the receivables days, and as compared with the previous year, the receivables days have increased. So you need to consider whether there is any other point in relation to receivables in the scenario. If it is mentioned that the creditworthiness of the customers is affected, so you can combine both of this together and give it as a single risk. The creditworthiness of the customers have affected very badly over the past 1 year. In addition to which, the receivables days have been increased from 10 days to 20 days. Therefore, it represents a possibility of having bad and doubtful debts, and you can explain it further. Same as that way, if it is required to calculate the operating profit margin and gross profit margin, and if it is shown in the computation that the gross profit margin has increased, however the operating profit margin of the company has been decreased, in which case you can analyze the possibility of having misclassification of expenses between cost of sales and operating expenses. Same as that, if there is possibility of increase in the amount of receivables days, you can consider that the possibility of having slow moving or obsolete inventory is present. Therefore, the company should have written down the inventory to the lower of cost or NRV. However, this might not have been taken place by the company, which will result in overstated inventory and understated related expenses. So in this manner, you can analyze each of the risk based on the computed ratios. But if there are related scenarios, then you should connect the scenario and the ratio together, and you should give it as a single risk. So this is how you need to perform the analytical procedures in relation to the audit risk. So you should revise all the important ratios in your FR, including the operating profit margin, gross profit margin, receivables days, inventory days, payables days, current ratio, quick ratio, interest cover ratio, gearing ratio. All this can be asked by the examiner. And if the examiner is only asking you to calculate just 2 ratios, and if there are more risk from the scenario which you can identify in relation to the additional ratios, then in that case you can calculate other ratios as well, and you can interpret the risk based on that. But you will be getting computation related mark only for those only for those ratios which have been asked by the examiner. So that's the only difference. So when you get a question on audit risk, so make sure that you are focusing on each of these areas. You should be properly identifying your risk, explaining it, and you should be providing proper response for each of the risk identified. So as I mentioned earlier, practice maximum number of questions as possible from this area, because it is one of the most important and core area of our syllabus. So all the very best everyone, do practice and score high marks in the paper AA Audit and Assurance. Thank you so much everyone, and all the very best for your upcoming AA exams.